I didn't know anything about the Frith microcolonies before being taken there. The name hadn't jogged any memories of mine when they announced my sentence. I figured that, following all the illicit activity I had done for the Steel Syndicate, a couple more life sentences or even the death penalty was more in order. It was a relief, really, though looking back it shouldn't have been. As usual for people that piss the Coalition off too much, I didn't get a court hearing or a lawyer. I was in the hands of the Galactic Police, who had always been just a few steps away from being an organized military. After waiting at the Galactic Police Station for what seemed like hours, I was eventually greeted by a sinister-looking officer in full body armor. Either he thought I really was that much of a threat, or he just dressed up to intimidate me.
You're going to be taken to Frith to participate in the Coalition's microcolony sociological experiment. While this is not a form of incarceration by the strictest definitions, we expect you will remain there for the rest of your natural life.
I knew the officer was improvising a few things as he spoke, but it was hard to tell how much from his monotone voice.
Please hold out one of your designated gripping appendages so I can give you your study group number.
That part was definitely scripted. I held out my hand as the officer produced a digital stamp creator, imprinting the number 13 onto my hand in non-fading digital ink.
When we arrive at the transfer satellite above Frith, you will go straight to the room with the same number and wait. Follow me to the hangar.
I got up to follow him when he suddenly turned around and stared straight at me.
Also, don't forget that you will be under constant surveillance. Be compliant.
I didn't like having to look at the glowing cyan lights of his helmet while he said this. It reminded me of those demotivational posters they put in high-security prisons. The ones that had mottos like, "Justice begets morality," and "Our authority keeps the Coalition together." I walked out to the hangar with him and got loaded onto a transport ship along with a bunch of other people. We all seemed to be headed to the same place. There wasn't any conversation among us while the ship folded over to Frith and entered orbit. We were all too busy contemplating what was going to happen to us. When we arrived and docked with the satellite, we were separated as officers aboard the satellite directed us to our corresponding doors. I moved hastily over to door 13, which led to a decently sized oval room fitted with a large metal bench that wrapped the entire length around it. I counted 13 other people in the room aside from me. There were 6 other humans, all of which were just minding their own business. An intimidating muscular Dur, a short Hayumvac, male prefect, who seemed more anxious than anyone else in the room, 3 Clume androids that were making small talk, and 2 Siluxians, one that was staring down at the floor deep in thought, and another that was napping on the bench. I tried to sit somewhere away from everyone else. The Hayumvac ended up being the closest person to me. I got a better look at him once I sat down. It was hard not to feel sad for a scared Hayumvac. They were short and thin, with big heads and huge eyes that stared straight through your heart. If you spooked them, they would yelp like a dog as the quills on the back of their arms stood on end. After noticing me, he slid over a bit closer and looked me in the eyes.
"They didn't tell you anything about this experiment, did they?"
he asked nervously. I shook my head. The Hayumvac stared down.
"All this secretism can't be good. I need to know what they're going to do with us,"
he muttered. I had a hard time believing a scrawny Hayumvac like him could have done something bad enough to warrant being sent to Frith. A couple minutes of total silence passed before a small group of Zogzians entered the room. There were 5 of them, all wearing similar clothing to one another and staying really close together. Seeing as how their bioluminescent Zogzian decals were all yellow, it was safe to say that they knew each other pretty well. They sat down together and started intertwining their antennae, talking to each other in complete silence. No wonder the Zogzians are called the best secret keepers of the galaxy. I tried to avoid looking at them. Seeing their giant gaping mouths and freakish insectoid features was enough to make anyone sick to their stomach. Shortly after they entered, a well-dressed researcher came into the room accompanied by 2 guards in full body armor. He smiled as he greeted us, which, regardless of his intention, felt malicious. He launched into this big speech about what the Frith Microcolony Project was and how it benefited Coalition research and how, despite our poor legal standings, we were doing the Coalition a great favor by simply being a part of the experiment. He explained to us that because Frith had no atmosphere and was almost completely uninhabitable, the microcolonies were located underground in gigantic climate-controlled vaults, each about 10 kilometers squared. Beyond that, he said it was best that we knew almost nothing else about the experiment, which didn't give any of us much confidence. The last thing he told us was that the room we were in was connected to a simple planetary lander that would take us down to the planet's surface and connect with one of the vaults, which is the only thing that remotely surprised me. At first glance, I hadn't expected the room to double as a landing craft, too. The researcher and guards left as quickly as they had arrived, and only seconds afterward, we all felt a big jolt as the landing craft disconnected from the satellite and started its descent. There weren't any windows, so we all had to guess what was happening outside based on sound alone. The fall was pretty smooth thanks to Frith's non-existent atmosphere. At some point, we heard large clamps grab onto the sides of the lander and loud motors start up shortly afterward. This continued for at least a minute, after which the motors stopped and the door opened, letting a bright yellow light into the room. We were afraid at first, but one by one, each of us got up to go see what was outside. When I got out, I couldn't believe what I saw. A rippling, lush landscape speckled with all sorts of plants. Looking up, the light that we saw was being produced by a network of huge lights above us on the ceiling of this supposed vault. They were dimmed to mimic the color of the sun at dawn, and looked pretty close to the real thing. In the distance, we saw 4 towering walls that boxed us into the vault, each one rising staggeringly high into the air. Behind us, there was a tall cylindrical pillar that the lander had descended down through. A slice of habitable land nestled inside a giant metal crate underground. How surreal. It was breathtaking to look at, creating the same feeling you got from seeing a black hole mine or a Dyson sphere for the first time. We all spent a good chunk of our first moments there taking in the scenery. As I sat down on the soft dirt underneath us, the Humevac whom I had been sitting with spoke up. I think he spoke for all of us when he asked that dreaded question.
What do we do now?
It was obvious that we would need to survive, but would we do that together or individually? 10 kilometers squared was plenty of space for 19 people, but it was hard to tell how we would divvy it up if nobody wanted to cooperate. The question didn't stay up in the air for long, thankfully. The Dur that had come along decided to take charge. He had been looking around near where the lander touched down and found multiple containers of various sizes attached to the sides of the elevator that had brought us down. We all gathered around and opened them up. Inside there were all sorts of survival supplies, food, water, tools, the exact same stuff they gave to pioneers who established colony foundations on planets. We even got an autotiller and a small nano-assembler, which came pre-packed with blueprints for basic structures we could live in. There were weapons in there too, precision laser rifles, Lapidus tech. I assumed they were for hunting, but I hadn't seen any animals in the vault yet. A few people tried to take some of the supplies, but the Dur stopped them.
These are all we have to survive. I'm not letting anybody take more than their fair share.
He looked at the supplies more closely.
We'll split up the food evenly among all of us. The tools and weapons are only for the people who know how to use them.
The Dur asked us all to say our names and if we had any skills that could help us survive in the vault. The Silexians both said they were skilled with technology, no surprise there. One of the Zogzians spoke up and said that she and all of her friends were hunters. Not a lot of people said anything beyond that. Skills like basic manufacturing and farming were all handled by machines nowadays, so none of us had them. The vault blocked Omninet connections too, so there was no way for the Clume androids or the few cyborgs to download information like that. All we had to rely on were the tools we had brought and our own bodies. It was no wonder we weren't very confident. Incredibly though, we managed. The first week went surprisingly well. Klurt, the Dur, was usually the one calling the shots. We always did what he said, and usually it turned out well. His harsh, commanding voice, and the fact that he was larger than almost everyone else in the colony, made it easy for him to assert his position as leader. I figure the reason we let him keep it was because we desperately needed at least some form of leadership during those early days. It gave us structure. We scattered around and found that the vault was extremely varied in the kinds of life it contained. There were plants from all over the galaxy growing in there, even though most of them wouldn't have made it in the temperate Earth-like environment we were in. It wasn't uncommon to see a Jirian sponge tree growing right in the middle of a patch of perfectly normal Earth grass. The Coalition must have done some extensive genetic engineering to everything in the vault, since we found that they could all grow equally well and equally quickly in those conditions. Not many of them were edible, but we had gotten seed packs with the autotiller, so farming was still an option. There were animals too, small to medium-sized herbivores and a few predators, again from all over the galaxy. We hunted extensively, but slowed down later on as we realized we ran the risk of hunting them to local extinction. The Coalition didn't seem to restock anything we harvested in the vault. We cut down a lot of cloyber trees in order to build houses for everyone. They were one of the only plants I actually expected to be down there. Since they could grow quickly in almost any environment, they were a popular choice on farming colonies for cheap building materials. We fed the wood into our nano-assembler and built plenty of habitats. Just as I had expected, the lights overhead shifted their luminosity to mimic the passing of day and night. Sometimes it even rained, but none of us were sure how. Things were simpler during those early weeks. Everyone was too focused on getting our basic necessities taken care of to ask complex questions. As things slowed down, though, we started to wonder, what would the future hold? There were a lot of things to consider if we were going to be down there for the rest of our lives. Our first concern was reproduction. There was no shortage of females in our group, 9 out of us 19. The problem was species. Out of the 7 humans in our group, only 2 were females, a taller, reserved woman named Genwo, and a shorter, more stocky girl named Rika. They didn't know each other or any of us, and were too busy at first to build any relationships. The Zogzians were all female, and since they had the same yellow markings, they were all part of the same Zogzian Ulikbo, making them all sisters. The 2 Silugzians were male and female respectively, but they didn't get along very well, which wouldn't bode well for them in the future. One of the Klooms said they were female, but that didn't mean much coming from a sentient cloud of bacteria inside a robot. It was Klurt and the Huumvek Nivelo who were in a really bad situation. They were alone in their ranks, which only added to the stress of working inside the colony. It got to Nivelo faster than anybody else.
We're stuck down here for the rest of our lives. Am I really the only person that's bothered by this?
He asked me one day while we were collecting a small harvest of fast-growing Terran potatoes. I'm sure it's on everyone's mind. They just don't show it as much. They're too busy focusing on the present to be bothered by the future, I replied.
But we can't just ignore it forever. Sooner or later we'll have to figure out what we're headed towards. I need to know.
I knew why Nivelo was so worried. A healthy Huumvek could live for centuries. Assuming nothing happened to him, he would outlive all of us eventually, so certainty about the future was something he needed more than anyone. Maybe there was another reason we never thought about the future too much. None of us believed we would live long enough to see it. After Nivelo told me this, I tried to talk to Klurt to see what he thought, but he just told me it wasn't important and gave me another job to do. I didn't bring it up with him after that. Deep down, I knew we all felt exactly like Nivelo. Our first death happened around the middle of the second week. A human named Jack killed himself from what we can only assume was stress. Shortly after that, one of the Kloom androids named Quinosik wandered away into a small patch of forest away from our camp and didn't come back. The Silugzians both said we should go looking for them, since even if they were dead, we could use the parts from their robot body to repair and maintain our tools. Klurt denied the request, saying it was disrespectful to loot the dead, and that we couldn't risk losing anybody else. We buried Jack near the river a kilometer away from our camp. Klurt confiscated his belongings and said they were the property of the colony now. He reminded us that nobody could take more supplies from the colony than they needed, and this time he added that we should exile anybody caught breaking the rules.
We aren't going to survive very long if nobody here has any respect for authority. I hope you all understand this, because otherwise, we're going to have a lot of problems,
he told us one night, around a campfire we had made. I found it interesting to hear him talk, considering none of us would be stuck there if we cared about authority. It made me wonder what the rest of these people had done to deserve being sent to Frith. I didn't ask Klurt about it, obviously, but there were others that were willing to share. Rika's story was particularly interesting.
I've done all sorts of things to piss off the Coalition, but what really made them want to send me here was my habit of escaping, she told me once after I had brought the question up. I got out of a bunch of smaller prisons before moving on to bigger ones. Maximum security prison satellites were next, followed by the Twaipa Penal Colony, Re-Education Matrix, and that one prison that you forget almost everything about the second you leave it. I had never heard of anything like that last one. Made sense. This place is still a prison, albeit an unconventional one. The problem is, I can't think of any way of escaping. She looked worried after saying that. Maybe after a while, I won't want to anymore. Rika wasn't lying about the vault being hard to escape. We couldn't find any way of making the lander go back up the shaft it had come down through, and there didn't seem to be any way outside of the vault aside from that. A few people trekked to one of the walls to see what they were made out of. Nuclear-forged osmium, the same stuff they used to build plasmized munitions. If they could theoretically survive being engulfed in searing hot plasma, there was nothing we could use to breach them. Not that it would have mattered, of course. All that was on the other side of them was solid rock. I talked to Rika a lot more after that. I liked her. It always seemed like she had something interesting to say, which really helped break up the monotony of daily life. We had quite a scare near the beginning of week 4. Our autotiller broke down, and the Coalition hadn't been nice enough to give us replacement parts for it. One of the Silugzians inspected it and said it would never work again if we couldn't repair it, and if that was true, we would starve.
Maybe if you would let us go and retrieve Quinisik's body from the forest, I would have the materials to repair it.
None of us liked that notion, but it was correct.
I already said we can't do that. We have to have decency.
Klurt was adamant. He wasn't letting anybody break the rules, even when starvation was on the line.
What do you know about decency? What do any of us know about decency? We're all ruthless, savage lawbreakers, right? None of us would be here if we had decency.
He was hysterical, but was particularly angry at Clert.
You need to step off your fucking high horse and realize the situation we're in. Morality didn't mean anything when my life was at stake in the past. Why should it now?
I figured Clert might resort to violence after that, considering how temperamental his race is, but he kept his cool. He said the Siluxian was on house arrest for 24 hours because of that behavior, and stationed the remaining 2 Clume as guards since they didn't need to sleep or eat very much. We all figured he would be fine in the morning after having some time to think. The next time we checked on his hut, both of the Clume were gone. We found the remains of their robot bodies inside, along with the autotiller, fully repaired, and with a note attached to it that read, "You all know it had to be done." The Siluxian was gone. It didn't take a genius to figure out what had happened. We searched around near the camp, but couldn't find any trace of him. Clert said he wasn't worth looking around for any further. He had already made his choice. After that, things started to go downhill, and quickly. People started dying left and right. 2 more humans disappeared a few days later. They went hunting and didn't come back. We assumed they had been mauled by animals and didn't go out to look for them. Then, every last one of the Zongxians disappeared, though they actually left some traces that we could follow. We found them at the far end of the vault, doing some digging near the wall. When Clert asked them what they were doing, a single Zongxian got up and confronted us.
"I will speak on behalf of my sisters,"
said the Zongxian. We learned after a while that she was the only Zongxian of her group that had a nanolarynx implant, and therefore was the only one that could speak.
"We are attempting to breach the walls of this vault and escape. The Yolikbo Porvatmi has most likely noticed our disappearance, and will send a ship to this planet to rescue us."
I had a feeling the Zongxians had lost their minds. Even if what they were saying was true, the Coalition had ground-to-space gun emplacements on Frith. They couldn't come anywhere close to the planet's surface. Nivelo overlooked this, however. He was just happy to hear that there was a possibility of escape after so long.
Can we come along too? There has to be enough room in the ship for all of us.
"We aren't your friends. The Zonzians look out for their Yolikbo and for their species. Nobody else."
Nivelo was furious. We all were. But Clert kept us from doing anything. We left the Zongxians to their own devices and headed back to camp. I never saw them again after that. Maybe they died of exhaustion or got mauled by wild animals. Maybe they actually did escape and are cruising the galaxy as I speak. It doesn't matter at this point. There were 7 of us left. Any hope we had before was shattered. We kept our camp running as best as we could, but most of the time, we just sat around doing nothing. I knew then that deep down we were all cowards. We were all too afraid of living to see the future, but too afraid of death to not see it. There was nothing we could do. I wondered if the Coalition had expected this to happen, if they had known from the start we wouldn't survive long enough to even raise families. With the way the vault was designed, it seemed likely. Nivelo was nice enough to confirm my theory.
They called this an experiment, didn't they? We're their test subjects. They've been watching us this whole time, look!
He held out his hand, and it was a small insect, barely large enough to be visible. I squinted and noticed it gleamed like it was made out of metal. It was a clever disguise for a spy drone. They're collecting data on everything we do. We must be worth millions to the Coalition scientific community. I hated thinking of myself as a lab rat. What do you think they're going to use it for?
Criminal research, most likely. Friv makes the authority sector more efficient with each passing year. It's sad to admit, but what we're going through right now isn't coming to an end anytime soon. I have a feeling there's a bit more to it than that.
Rika joined in on our conversation abruptly as she walked in, adding a few logs of Cloyber wood to a pile near the big bonfire we had at camp. She sat down on the bench next to me.
This isn't just a research project. The Coalition is trying to prove something about the way we act.
I assume she meant we, as in the people bad enough to be sent to Frith. What's that? Nivelo and I both said the same thing at the exact same time.
The authority sector has always been selective in the way it dispenses justice. They're nice to the people who screw up once or twice, but once you start getting too good at breaking the law, start being a repeat offender, that's when they show their real colors. For them, it's not about justice, it's about entertainment. They let us scamper about the galaxy, knowing full well they can go out and leisurely hunt us down whenever they please. Of course, not everybody is comfortable with treating the citizens of the Coalition as game animals. That's what they're trying to change with this whole experiment. They want to see if we really are just psychopaths once we're stripped of our connections to the outside world. If their theory turns out to be right, they don't have to feel a single bit of remorse for anything they do to us.
Rika's words really stuck with me after that. I liked to think of myself as having at least some limits, but after everything that had happened, I wasn't so sure. Maybe we were all just a few short steps away from being in the same position as that Silexian that had fixed the autotiller. It reminded me of the story of Planet Roanoke. From what I had heard a few years back, Coalition scouts had discovered a small village on a distant border world, completely isolated. There were no records of any public or private colonization affairs made in that part of space, so it was assumed that the colony was something independently owned, not sanctioned by the government or a company. The problem was, it was totally devoid of people. Nobody knows what happened to them, but the leading theory is that they somehow got stranded on their planet and, over time, regressed to savagery and killed each other. Those kinds of stories really got to me. I could deal with people killing each other, I'd done plenty of that myself, but I didn't want to lose my humanity in the process. I used to think it was something the Coalition couldn't take away from me, but it looked like they would prove me wrong yet again. I tried to get at least a little sleep that night, but the smell of smoke and glow of fire outside the windows of my hut woke me up after just a few hours. I rushed outside to see what was going on. Clert's hut was being incinerated. There was nothing but flame where it used to be. Nivolo was standing at it in awe, a small torch in his left hand. When he turned around to face me as I walked over, I saw that he had this awful look of guilt and sadness on his face. "Why'd you do it?" I had to yell over the flames.
I'm not brave enough,"
he stammered out to me. The moment he finished his sentence, a blinding streak of laser light hit him right in the neck. He made this guttural noise for a few seconds and then dropped dead. I looked to where the shot had come from. There was Rika, clutching one of her hunting rifles in her hands. She looked just as worried about the whole situation as Nivolo had.
"None of us are surviving this,"
she said to me. I thought for a moment she was going to shoot me, too, but just then the other humans emerged from their huts to see what was happening. I fled the second I saw them. As I grabbed the few supplies I could carry and started to run away from the camp, I heard more laser blasts in the distance. I ran as far away as I could, only stopping once I hit one of the walls of the vault. Behind me, I could still see dim flames. They have to be all dead now. I don't see any possible way they could still be alive. I should feel relieved knowing I outlasted everyone else, but I don't. I feel sick. I've had to spend the last night or so alone, sitting in front of the meager fire I could create using the tools I had, insects buzzing around me. I will die eventually. That's the only thing about the future I can be sure of. But how that's going to happen is something I'm not sure I have the bravery to figure out. I figure that, right about now, the scientists that are running this experiment are making bets on how I'm going to die. Starvation, animal attacks. It's safe to assume suicide is the highest number of votes. In the end, Rika was right. This was all just a game, where the Coalition always gets to be the winner. There's really no sense in complaining now. The Coalition got what it wanted. It always does. And we got what we deserved. We always do.